Happy Wednesday, and welcome back to Sports Scene. I'm Hayes Flanagan.
I'm Chaz Messman.
I'm Patrick Warren.
And I'm Will Camardella.
Coming off a bye week, USC slides into the AP Top 10, securing the number 10 spot tied with Wake Forest. After a win against Texas, Oklahoma State takes 9, and Oregon slides into 8 after a dominating win over the UCLA Bruins. The Bruins dropped 3 spots and now sit at number 12, and Utah is not far behind them at number 14. After a wild 2 weeks of Pac-12 football, 4 teams in the Pac-12 sit in the top 15. The top 6 teams have been consistent, only to have USC slide in there for a week. And TCU keeps shocking the country, climbing to number 7. With 4 Pac-12 teams in the top 15, where do you guys think these teams will sit at the end of the year? And who do we think you will see in the Pac-12 championship?
I think all 4 could finish the year in the top 25. I think the Utah-Oregon game will be interesting to see what happens with that. Utah could take a tumble there. And I think that if all things go according to plan and Oregon does beat Utah, it will be Oregon and USC in the championship.
I mean, this is a wide open year. Outside of the top 2 of Georgia and Ohio State, who knows what's going to happen? Big shout out to TCU. You mentioned them soaring up the rankings. How about Max Duggan? He is a dark horse candidate for the Heisman Trophy this year. That kid started the year as the backup, and now he is playing better than arguably any quarterback, maybe outside of C.J. Stroud and Caleb Williams, in the entire country. Hats off to him. That offense is absolutely rolling this season. TCU, watch out for them. They could end up in the college football playoff.
Well, it's pretty crazy how these rankings sometimes go. USC, undefeated for most of the season, just stuck at 6. Can't pass Clemson, can't pass Michigan. Now they lose a game and they don't play and they rise 2 spots in the rankings. So it's funny them going to 12 to 10. As far as a Pac-12 championship game goes, my expectation is that Oregon runs the table and so does UCLA. I think you see a rematch of that game in the final.
And I'm honestly really excited for the Pac-12. I think we've seen, like last year, oh God, USC's struggling, UCLA's struggling, and then this news gets announced that we're going to the Big Ten. But I think it's really exciting for Pac-12 football that it's competitive this year, that we have these 4 teams in the top 25 and playing really well. And I think it should be really exciting to see who goes to this Pac-12 championship.
The Pac-12 is probably the second deepest conference in the entire country this year. You have so many different teams making an impact. As you mentioned, 4 teams in the top 25, and one of those teams is Oregon. Oregon is now surging back up the rankings after their dominant 45-30 victory over UCLA. That makes it 6 straight wins for the Ducks, moving them up to number 6 in the country. Oregon took a 17-10 lead early in the second quarter and just never looked back. Bo Nix had his best game in an Oregon uniform, throwing for 283 yards and 5 touchdowns. He also rushed for another 51 yards. The Ducks rushed for 262 yards as a team, with Bucky Irving rushing for 107. Their offensive line was dominant from the start, providing big holes for Irving and company. They also did not allow a sack. For UCLA, Dorian Thompson-Robinson threw 262 yards and 2 scores, but he threw a costly interception. Zach Charbonnet continued his fantastic season, rushing for 151 yards and a touchdown. The Pac-12 is wide open right now. 4 teams are fighting for 2 spots. That's Oregon, USC, UCLA, and Utah for that Vegas championship games. How do you guys see this whole thing playing out?
Well, I think you take a look at how that UCLA-Oregon game went. I think you'd be hard to argue that Oregon is not the best team in this conference right now. Just the game Bo Nix had, throwing for over 400 yards, 5 touchdowns, and just the quality of throws that he was making, airing it out down the field. That's as good a game as he's had in his entire career, and Oregon's going to ride him to a lot of wins down the stretch.
And I will say I was shocked watching that game because I'm expecting Zach Charbonnet to make a masterpiece out of this and really show out Oregon, but I was honestly shocked at Oregon's performance, and that honestly made me believe that it's going to be USC, Oregon, and especially how everyone's schedules play out, that USC is going to play UCLA. Hopefully they get the win, and then you see that Oregon's going to play Utah. I assume, as rankings go right now, you would say that Oregon's going to beat Utah, and then you see that matchup going into the Pac-12 championship. I mean, that is what one can predict looking at past games and future schedules right now.
Totally, and I think that Bo Nix could easily provide a difficult game for USC, just based on their history with dual threat quarterbacks. Bo Nix, he really has been looking great this season.
So I don't have as much confidence in Oregon as you guys all do. And it simply comes down to Bo Nix. You don't know what you're going to get with him. Are you going to get good Bo Nix or horrendous Bo Nix? He's the guy that could throw 5 touchdowns in a game, but also throw 3 interceptions the next week. I mean, Pac-12 championship games in Vegas, Bo Nix is literally a roulette spin. Good, bad, or who knows? So that's the thing. Luckily for him, he plays good at home, and Utah has to go to Autzen Stadium when they play Oregon. So that's their biggest advantage. But at the same time, Oregon could drop a game to a team like Oregon State, and the way that the Pac-12 championship game is going to work this year, where it's just the top 2 teams, that could knock them right out.
Exactly, and you make a great point that Utah game is going to be at Oregon, and we saw 2 Saturdays ago that Utah brings a crowd, and Utah really bases their energy off of that crowd, as we saw in the second half of the USC Utah game. So I do think it'll be a big deal that Utah Oregon game is at Oregon.
And then how about USC UCLA? Right now, it's looking like that could determine which one of those teams ends up going to the Pac-12 championship game, whether that is against Oregon, or who knows, things could work out. We could see USC UCLA 2 out of 3 weeks.
We certainly could. But following another battle of Pac-12 heavyweights, the USC Trojans are undefeated no longer, falling to the Utah Utes 43-42 in one of the most competitive games of the college football season. The 2 teams exchanged touchdowns all night, but after Utes' final scoring drive, Kyle Whittingham went for 2 with 48 seconds to go, leading to a Cameron Rising score that gave Utah its first lead of the night. USC still had time to kick a field goal as time expired, but a few key penalties on the final drive stalled their final push. Although they were on the losing side of the game, the Trojans' offense had a dominant outing, putting up their highest point total in a road game this season. Quarterback Caleb Williams had a monster performance in Salt Lake City, throwing for 381 yards and 5 touchdowns, while getting many of his teammates involved offensively. Mario Williams and Jordan Addison both had over 100 receiving yards, and 4 different Trojans caught touchdown passes from Williams. Travis Dye was effective on the ground in limited carries for USC, running for just under 7 yards per carry and scoring the game's first touchdown.
So I got to ask you all now, after such an effective performance from this USC offense, is it fair to say they're back on track?
I think it is. I mean, we're missing Jordan Addison this week potentially, and that could hurt them. But there are some receivers who've stepped up, and I mean, Caleb Williams is really looking great this last week.
Yeah, the Addison injury would worry me a lot more had that performance in Utah not happened. And if you take a look at it, you get touchdown catches from Michael Jackson, Josh Fallow, Kyron Hudson. Fallow and Jackson hadn't had a catch going into this game. Caleb Williams is finally figuring out how to use all of his teammates offensively, and when you do that, your offense just reaches a completely different dimension.
I agree 100%. You can look at the numbers and you can say, this was great for USC. This was great for USC's offense. Caleb Williams had a stellar game, didn't end the way we wanted to, but you got to look at the penalties. That is how we lost that game, and I know you could blame it on the Pac-12 refs, whatever. There's some things you can't control in the end, but I do have to say penalties are discipline, and I want to see that discipline come up, and I want to see USC really focusing on what they did wrong and going back and saying, this is how we do not lose this game in the future, and a lot of those penalties were on the offensive line, and I do want to see that change in the future.
USC's offense is not the worry of this team. They already had a stinker against Oregon State. That's not going to happen the rest of the season. Arguably, this is the second deepest weapons group for any offense in the country, probably outside of Ohio State. We're seeing guys, as you mentioned, step up that haven't had a catch yet. Then another guy that I want to talk about is Taj Washington. He's a guy that could really be stepping up in the absence of a Jordan Addison. And it's not just what he does with the ball, and we saw what he could do setting up a touchdown when he has the ball in his hands, but off the ball. He is arguably the best blocking receiver that USC has, and he set up a Travis Dye touchdown.
Yeah, and his special teams play has been really impressive as well. He had a couple of really good returns in that Utah game.
Yeah, but when you take a look at the offense as well, again, what makes you feel so encouraged after a game like that is playing to the identity that I think a lot of people would want to see them play to, and that's explosive plays. You take a look at 15-plus yard runs and 20-plus yard passes. They had 13 in the game. That is a huge number. That's having your explosive players make explosive plays, and you can really shell-shock a lot of opposing teams when you have that kind of production.
And Lincoln Riley is the best play caller for setting up those explosive plays. every time you watch USC, there are so many wide open wide receivers, 20 yards down the field, whatever concept that he runs, whether it's a mesh or levels, there's always someone that is in space. And with the athletes that USC has on the perimeter, these big plays are going to happen. It's just whether or not the defense can keep it in check.
And exactly, USC has those weapons, so I want to see them use all of them.
Yeah. Although football also won in the trenches, and the one thing you would have concern of, besides the penalties, which you mentioned, would be the offensive line. Caleb Williams was sacked 4 times in this game. That certainly just cannot happen long term. You got to keep your quarterback upright. But on the other side of the ball, the Utes had their way with the USC defense. The Trojans gave up over 40 points for the first time all season and allowed the game-winning touchdown with just seconds to go. The unit got off to a decent start, holding Utah off the scoreboard on 3 of its first 4 offensive drives, but as the game progressed, they had no answer for Utah's passing game. Cameron Rising had 415 yards with 2 touchdowns and found the end zone 3 more times on the ground. His favorite target was tight end Dalton Kincaid, who caught 16 passes for a whopping 234 yards, the second most in the game in a history of the Utah program. The Trojans allowed touchdowns on 5 of the final 6 drives, leading the Utes to victory. So after a game like that, how high is your level of concern with this defense?
For me, the concern's still the same. I think this was the problem that we all saw coming at the beginning of the season. They were able to mask it early on with a lot of turnovers, but that's not sustainable. This defense has gaping holes, and one that got really exposed by Kincaid was in that nickelback spot.
I mean, it's hard because Rising is one of many good quarterbacks in the Pac-12, and we've seen it, and we saw his dominant offense. And I think it's going to be hard because USC is going to see DTR too, and the defense has more struggles coming up. So I think it calls for concern, especially
with the injuries as of late with Eric Gentry and Shane Lee. There's definitely some concern in that linebacker position on who's going to step up and take some of that responsibility now that there might be some absences come Arizona.
Certainly. I think a lot of the talk about this defense throughout the season when they have been playing better is how many turnovers they've been able to force. But the other thing that they did really well throughout the season is getting to the quarterback and making big plays in the backfield. You know how many tackles for loss they had in that Utah game? 1 tackle for loss, never got Utah into 3rd and long, never was able to get them into an advantageous position, and because of that, Utah converted just about every 3rd and 4th down they had. They did not properly get off the field, and that was their biggest problem.
And it's it's hard when your offense is making such progress. I mean, USC went up 14-0, and then you see the Utah just slowly coming back, and then you see the defense slowly breaking down, and it's hard to watch because you're like, you have Caleb Williams and all these weapons, and then your defense is just slowly giving in.
They really struggled to maintain those explosive plays. When you have a 14-point lead on the road, you just can't let that slide. And a big problem outside of just letting receivers run right up the seam and letting Cam Rising just drop dimes is they were really struggling with tackling, especially in the second half. And that's something you just can't do on defense. The most important thing on defense is what? Tackling. I mean, think about that 2-point conversion. 3 different USC Trojans had an opportunity to take down Cam Rising and win the game. They didn't do it. He ended up scoring the 2-point conversion. Game over.
And it's not just the 2-point conversion he ran in either. It's the touchdown that, presumably would have tied the game had Whittingham not taken that risk. I don't think there was a guy more happy to watch that USC-Utah film than Dorian Thompson-Robinson.
Zach Charbonnet?
Because, him too. But, USC's inability to contain a rushing quarterback is going to be a serious long-term concern.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think just those long drives Utah had at the end just broke down the defense. I think Lincoln Riley had some timeouts he could have used, especially on that last touchdown drive for Utah. But with the 2 weeks off following the loss in Utah, the Trojans have had plenty of time to prepare for the second half of the season.
Well, they throw the ball about 50 times a game. Their quarterback has been very good through his career at Wazoo, and they also have some very good receivers.
The quarterback really kind of makes it all go. I mean, he's dynamic. I enjoyed watching him at Washington State. Watched him kind of fly around, make plays. He's pretty good within the scheme.
Jordan Addison and Eric Gentry went down with injuries against Utah, and Shane Lee missed the game completely with an injured wrist. Linebacker Tuasivi Nomura will likely see more playing time this weekend, as well as receivers Terrell Bynum, Michael Jackson III, and Kyle Ford. USC will travel to Tucson to take on the Wildcats Saturday in hopes of rebounding after falling short in Salt Lake. its Power 5 opponent. The Wildcats have allowed an average of 41.2 points per game against Power. USC's potent offense should have a field day against Arizona's weak secondary. Defending against Arizona's talented wide receiver core will be a top concern for USC. Jacob Cowing, Dorian Singer, and Teratoya McMillan have combined for over 1,800 yards and 15 touchdowns this season. They will pose a challenge for a Trojan secondary that has allowed 231 passing yards per game. Additionally, Washington State transfer Jalen DeLaura is a talented dual-threat quarterback, especially against a weakened linebacker room with Eric Gentry and Shane Lee both recovering from those injuries. So, if those two linebackers are out this weekend, is there any legitimate concern that USC could be upset by Arizona?
Not really. This is what we call a get-right game in the sport of football. You lose a tough game to Utah, but they've had 2 weeks off to really work on getting a lot better. And the big question for me in a game like this is those areas of concerns that we all just talked about in that Utah game. Do we see them getting better snap to snap? As far as this Arizona game goes, their defense is a disaster. The USC offense is going to have a field day with them, and that's my expectation.
I mean, I agree with the offensive point there. With that being said, DeLaura can really cause this USC defense some issues, especially with his legs. He's a talented player. Remember, back at Washington State, he won the Pac-12 Freshman of the Year last year. And especially if you don't have Eric Gentry, that can cause some real issues in the scramble drill. Because USC, we know they like to apply pressure, they bring the blitz. If he's able to escape that blitz and Eric Gentry's not out in the flat, Arizona could score some points. With that being said, not enough to beat USC.
Exactly. You make that point about DeLaura. We just play Cam Rising. I mean, come on. At least they could keep up with that a little bit. And USC's offense and defense, their motto is bend, don't break. So as long as we see USC's defense taking those fourth downs and kind of doing something with them, I really do think it's not going to be an issue. And Caleb will just keep going and keep scoring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be tough for Arizona to beat USC. I do think that it could be a high-scoring game.
Yeah, USC scored 66 in their first game against Rice. Arizona allowed 49 in a few of their last couple of games. Let's see if USC can break that 50, 55, 60-point mark in this game. That's what I'm watching.
Yeah.
The best defense for Arizona in this game is going to be offense. If they can control the ball, that's their only shot, because USC's secondary, or USC's perimeter weapons are going to absolutely torch the Arizona secondary.
Yeah, and I think all eyes will be on USC's defense now.
Over the weekend, the women's volleyball team traveled upstate for a weekend series against Cal and the number 7 ranked Stanford Cardinal. On Friday, the Trojans opened up with a convincing victory over Cal, winning 3-1. Senior hitter Amelia Wesky led the way, tallying 20 kills, while Mia Tuaniga continued to dominate, recording an impressive 62 assists. On Sunday, however, Stanford swept all 3 sets against the Trojans to win in a commanding fashion. Despite the loss, the Trojans sneaked inside the rankings, up at number 24. So, the Trojans go to Utah and Colorado this upcoming weekend. What do you want to see from this Trojan volleyball team?
I want to see that whatever happened in Stanford is going to stay in Stanford, right? You can't have that long-term memory, worry about what happened in that game. Stanford's a dominant volleyball team. They really are, and USC just wasn't in the same class as them, but that doesn't mean they can't beat a lot of other teams in the Pac-12. And so I'd like to see a big bounce back this weekend.
Totally. I mean, USC is a good team. They have a lot of good players, Skylar Fields probably being the best. They're 16-5. You know, it is a top 10 Stanford team that they were playing, so not exactly a surprising loss, but I think if they can kind of keep up some aggression, I think Stanford had 21 more kills than them, so I think just, you know, putting their hand on the ball and, you know, making it work.
Exactly, and I think they made huge headway this week getting into the top 25. I think you take that with you this weekend into Pac-12 play, and I think you win these games and you forget about Stanford, because Stanford is a historically great volleyball team. And so I think USC is trying to get in there and play with them, and I think it was what it was, and you got to go into this Pac-12 play before your postseason and win these games.
And you can still take away positives from a stretch like the Cal game, for example. Like, Veska had a career high in kills. Tuaniga had a career high in assists. Like, focus on that instead of worrying about not being as good as Stanford, and they should be able to bounce back pretty well. Heading into the pool, though,
it did not take USC water polo long to bounce back from its 4th loss of the season, knocking off Pepperdine last Saturday 13-11. The game was a back-and-forth affair with 5 lead changes throughout the contest. However, with the Trojans up by just 1 goal with less than 4 minutes remaining, Marcus Longton and Carson Kranz scored back-to-back goals in a minute and a half to put the game away. Kranz's goal sealed a hat trick for the junior, as him and Jake Earhart combined to score more than half of the Trojans' goals.
So how impressed were each of you following that big bounce-back win for the water polo team?
USC's back to doing what USC does. They are one of the best water polo teams in the country. They got their talisman, Jake Earhart, scoring goals, getting hat tricks. This is a team that's really starting to play some of their best ball going into the conference tournament, and that's going to be key if they want to make another run at a national championship.
Yeah, I'm honestly really excited. They had a rough start to the season. They've taken losses they shouldn't have as USC water polo, but I think this win was huge into going into the postseason again, and we see that, and hopefully it will give them some momentum.
And I think one thing, speaking of momentum, is starting the game strong. I think they've allowed the most goals in the first quarter for most of their games, especially the Cal and Pepperdine game. So I think just having an emphasis on defense in the first quarter will be important for them going forward.
Yeah, I would also say the momentum point doesn't just come from the fact that you won and it helped you in the standings, but just sort of the style of play. The fact that the game was so even, going back and forth so many times. The shots, USC won it by 5. That's a very competitive shot difference. So that's a playoff style of water polo, something you'd expect to see in the tournament. USC has just proven to the fans, but more importantly to themselves, that you can win that kind of game.
Yeah, let's take it from the pool to the soccer field. The women's soccer team headed west this past weekend for some Pac-12 play, stopping in Utah on Thursday and Boulder on Sunday. The Trojans struggled to put the ball in the net, only scoring once on their 2-game road trip. In the 0-0 draw against Utah, the Trojans looked like they were going to pull out the win with a last-minute goal by Peterson, but a Utah defender swept it away. The Trojans outshot the Utes 7-6. They then headed to Boulder, where they dominated the Buffs on the goal, outshooting them 21-6. However, Boulder still managed to score the first goal. The Trojans managed to put 1 goal away in the second half, which ended the game in a 1-1 draw. After this weekend's draws, the Trojans dropped to 18 in the United Soccer Coaches poll. This weekend, the Trojans play 2 home games against Washington and Washington State. USC needs these 2 wins before playing number 1 UCLA next week. Right now, the Trojans sit at number 3 in the Pac-12 with 3 conference games to go. What do you guys think will be their record after these 3 games?
UCLA will be a tough game for sure. It's good that that USC has Washington and Washington State coming up before then. And I think those are 2 teams they should beat. Washington State hasn't won a game since October 2nd in Utah. So with Croy Bethune, Helen Sampaio has had a great season as well. She has 6 assists. I think that the Trojans are playing some good ball.
Look, UCLA is arguably the best team in the entire country. I don't think that's the game you're looking at. You got to look at those 2 Washington schools, and those have to be must-wins for USC, especially coming off of a disappointing road trip. They should have won that Colorado game. They had the opportunities, they had the chances. They just happened to have 2 unlucky opportunities where they went off the woodwork. It happens. And in that Colorado game against when Colorado did score, their wingbacks just got caught a little too high up the field. Nice counterattack. The Colorado striker made a nice play, sticking the ball in the top corner. You can't do much about that. But when you have opportunities, you need to bury them. And they just didn't do it this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, all of us would agree it's never good to look ahead of what we would consider inferior opponents when a big game's coming down the road. But who are we kidding? It's UCLA. They're the best team in soccer right now, right up there. And it's a Crosstown Showdown. It's a big rivalry. So I'll look ahead to that. And if you want to beat a team that good, it's about focusing on how good your style of play is going into that game. I know the Colorado game was frustrating. I know they dominated in terms of shot percentage and couldn't finish. But you have to go back to the start of the season to see a stretch where USC was scoring so few goals. Like the first 3 games of the season is when they weren't scoring at the clip we've been sort of used to. So you look forward to the UCLA game and you look back at Colorado and you say, eventually those chances are going to go. We know this team can finish. We know they can dominate style of play. That's what's got to happen.
difference, though, in that UCLA game is they're not going to dominate that style of play. They're going to have to be more compact and try and hit them on the counterattack because UCLA has a better ball-playing midfield than USC does. That's just the reality.
Exactly, and I think it starts this weekend, though, really coming back to their roots. I want to see Bethune get out there, score a couple goals. I want to see Jackson giving those assists. I want to see that team chemistry again because I think it all comes back to USC's offense, and they get that momentum off of their goals. And I think it's been a hard couple of weeks coming off of those losses versus Arizona, and then going on this road trip and tying. Tying is the worst because you haven't lost and you haven't won. So you've done nothing, essentially. So I think it's going to be a huge weekend for USC women's soccer. And that's our weekly recap of USC athletics. It's been an amazing semester of sports so far, and we have much more to come. For everyone at Annenberg Media, we thank you to tuning in to Sports Scene. Thank you.